webinar, which will today be centered on conflict management and negotiations. So just before we begin, I would just like to share a few housekeeping items. So first, I will be presenting for approximately 20 minutes, and at the end of the 20 minutes, there will be time for some questions and answers. So do write your questions in the question box during the presentation. If you're interested in also taking a copy of my presentation, it will be available afterwards in the handout box. So please go into the GoToWebinar platform where it's available for download. So today's presentation is on stakeholder involvement for increased conflict management. And it will today focus on a case from Denmark, specifically the largest river infrastructure in Denmark, the river Gudenåen, and the process of creating a cross-municipal climate and flood protection plan with approximately 120 local stakeholders. But let me start by giving you a bit of context about myself and my project. My name is Miriam Jensen, and I'm an industrial PhD student within WSP Denmark. I come with a cross-disciplinary background within anthropology and climate and environmental studies. And before starting the PhD, I worked in the Middle East, specifically in Jordan, with a local NGO on conflict management. So an industrial PhD is a PhD project based within both the university and one or multiple companies. In my case, I'm working with Aalborg University, WSP Denmark, and Skanderborg Water Utility as my main partners. As case partners, I have the EU project C12 Gudenåen, which is a cross-municipal flood protection project, which includes 7 municipalities and Skanderborg Water Utility, as well as the Central Denmark region. You can see the title for my PhD project here on the slides. So my main research focus is to work with conflict management in these complex multi-stakeholder climate adaptation projects, where my main case is mainly on the largest river infrastructure in Denmark, Gudenåen. But let's just dive into the agenda before beginning. So firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about the case context. Then we're going to dive into the local stakeholder involvement, which I've been mostly involved in. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the method and more specifically about negotiations. And then I'm going to give you a sneak peek of my research on negotiations and time. Then we're going to have a conclusion and key takeaways, and then we're going to end with a Q&A session. Yes, so let's begin with the case context. So as I told you before, my case has been on this largest river infrastructure in Denmark called Gudenåen, which runs through 8 municipalities in Denmark. And through its way, from the very beginning of it and towards the ocean, it engages a range of various stakeholders, varying from museums to farmers to local businesses to nature and environmental organizations and so on. And the landscape adjacent to the river is very flat and consists mainly of farm and nature areas, and those are therefore also the areas more susceptible to flooding and other climatic or environmental changes within the river. And the river has seen environmental changes in the form of especially the invasive species zebra mussel, which has caused an increase in summer flooding since 2007, since it filters the algae and smaller particles, thus making the water more clear and plant growth more present in the main river. And we also see more flooding during winter time, more heavy rainfall events, and we also see longer periods of drought. Yeah, and as I told you a bit about before, we have this EU project concerned with the whole of the river, and then we also have this cross-municipal cooperation. And what happened was that in 2019 and 2020, we saw great flooding, a 100-year rainfall event, which is pictured here. On one hand, you can see a local inn known for its important cultural history in the area, as well as key nature farming areas and infrastructure, which was also badly hit by the flooding. And this caused political and local mobilization in the various municipalities. And in February 2020, the 7 mayors of the municipality decided to develop a cross-municipal master plan for both flood protection and climate adaptation for the entire river infrastructure. And so the status from there on is that we have now finalized both the technical aspect of the plan as well as the local stakeholder involvement. And here local politicians, municipalities, and approximately 120 local stakeholders with various interests in the river have been involved. And I've mainly been involved in the stakeholder involvement of the process, but WSP Denmark has also been involved in more technical aspects of the master plan, which includes several flood protection scenarios and flood calculations for the entire river infrastructure. But that's not going to be my focus today, but if you do have any questions about that, do write me and I can send you in the right direction. Yes, so let's talk a bit about the local stakeholder involvement in this master plan. And I've been involved in the cross-municipal stakeholder involvement from the very beginning. So prior to the involvement of local stakeholders in this climate adaptation master plan, I did several interviews with local stakeholders in an attempt to map out the non-economic values embedded in this flooded landscape. So firstly, I found that when flooding occurred, lost economic values were not always of utmost importance for local. Lost nature, lost access to recreational activities, lost cultural heritage values and traditions attached to the landscape and so on were just as important. And furthermore, we also, before engaging with the stakeholders, saw many contradictory values and interests among the stakeholders concerning solutions for the flooding. So the next step in this master plan was to invite relevant local stakeholders to workshops with the aim of including their local knowledge and visions in the master plan. And here we invited approximately 160 local stakeholders, and approximately 120 of them participated in the end. And these stakeholders represented a broad spectrum of interest, such as museums, local fisher associations, local farmer associations, tourism organizations, and so on. And we made it into online workshops due to the corona situation, of course. And here we divided the workshops into 4 workshops after the geographical location of the actors. So at these workshops, we decided to divide people into groups with 10 people in each group to kind of foster a good dialogue between them. And here we had 3 exercises in each group and an online map for the stretch of the river, which was discussed at that particular workshop. And you can see an example of such a map here to the right. So firstly, we started with an exercise where we asked each representative for an organization or association to outline his or her interests. And then we put it on online post-it notes in yellow, which you can see here to the right on the map. Then we, in collaboration with the attending local actors, mapped common interest on green post-it notes and contradictory interest on red post-it notes, which you can also see pictured here. And then we had an exercise in the end concerning the local actors' future visions for the river infrastructure. And it's especially this last exercise which I will focus more on today. So a little bit about the method and negotiations that we used here to involve the stakeholders, because the idea behind the stakeholder involvement in this master plan and the online workshops was to create a sort of negotiation room between the various contradictory visions, values, and interests that we found with these local actors. So we decided to apply the negotiation method, connective negotiation, which is also known as the mutual gains approach. And it's a negotiation method developed at Harvard University based on 20,000 observed negotiations from various places in the world. And it essentially has an aim at a win-win solution where every actor sort of gains something from the negotiation and no one loses. And the connective negotiation part of it has been developed by a Dutch company called P2, and we all attended a course on this method beforehand. So very shortly, the method consists of these 5 essences. So firstly, it's a keen focus on the interest of the local actors, not their positions. So a position could be, for example, here with the river, we had many environmental and nature organizations that focused on getting rid of all of the regulations on the river. So a position for them was to deregulate sort of the river. That's a position, but you kind of find the underlying interest. It's essentially just a question of asking why. Why is this your attitude? Why is this your vision? To kind of find new creative solution. And that kind of connects to the second essence, which is to create value or enlarge the pie, which essentially means to combine interest in new creative solutions and to create added value for more technical solutions as well. And then we have the third essence, which is know your partner, also known as the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And that essentially means that each actor comes to this negotiation table with a plan B, and the best plan B is the best alternative to the negotiated agreement. But that also means that they all come to the negotiation table with some sort of solution that they can achieve by themselves outside of the negotiation table. So we need to have that in mind when engaging in a negotiation situation, that we need to find a better solution than each participant's partner. And then we have the fourth essence, which is work on sustainable relationships, building trust, which essentially just means that we need to build up good relationships so we can actually trust each other, so we can actually have a good dialogue, that when local actors come to the table with various facts, we can actually trust them. And then we have the fifth essence, which is joint fact-finding. And that essentially means that in a negotiation, we want to find facts together with the local actors. We want to have a common foundation that we can find a solution from. Yeah, so in the 4 workshops, we mainly focused on essence 1, 2, and 4, and there is so much more to the MGA methods that I can talk about today. We also focused on a lot of other aspects, but it's just to give you an idea of the main themes that we have in mind in these various workshops. And I helped design the 4 workshops as I wanted to test this method in practice, especially with a focus on its application online, and as I wanted to combine the method with a focus on temporalities or time and a more long-term future perspective. And I now want to talk a bit about why I believe it's so important to also focus on time in our negotiations or in our conflict management, or in our processes of local stakeholder involvement. So the reason why I want to combine the method with a focus on time and especially the future was, first of all, that many of the negotiations I've been involved in are negotiations that take place in a kind of transformation time or within certain ruptures caused by change. So the point here is that we are facing some major changes in many of the physical environments which we move in, due to some climatic and environmental changes. And it also creates some changes in the systems and structure within which we move, which feeds into the various societal changes we see. So that also means a change in our worldviews and a change in our values. And we need to keep this in mind when embarking on negotiation processes such as the mutual gains approach or whichever method you are using, because it creates a different precondition or a different foundation for negotiating that is important to have in mind. So I therefore now wish to give you a bit of a sneak peek of my research and how we can include a future and temporality or time perspective in our negotiations and conflict management with various stakeholders. So first of all, I would like to point to a question that I've been preoccupied with at the River Gudenåen, which deals with the coordination between past and present in negotiation situations. Because the question I've been preoccupied with is, how do the stories about changes seen with the River Gudenåen, that is the past, affect how we meet in the present and negotiate the future river landscape? So in other words, what stories and different paths are the actors building on when they meet and negotiate? And how do they also differ in time? So the local perspectives on the river and the landscape are often different and are based on different stories about the river through time and its changes. So let me give you a few examples of this. So for example, here at the river, we have some museums that look at the river through some cultural historical glasses that go all the way back to the Stone Age. And they focus on how humans have moved with the river through time, while the local farmer here might look at the river through a generational time span, in the sense that the farmer might focus on who have lived there before him or her and how the usage of the land has changed. And then we might have the nature or environmental organizations that look at the river going maybe 100 years back in time and focus here on the relationships between humans and nature, and here especially pay attention to the various regulations of the river through time. So when meeting in present negotiations, all actors therefore talk about the river from various notions of it lying in different paths. And it is sometimes here that the perspectives actually differ, and are contradictory because, for example, nature and environmental organizations often talk about a river that goes back 100 years as sort of the ideal river Gudenåen in relation to its nature in particular, while many farmers or landowners often talk in a generational time span, as my grandfather or as my father did before me, and so on. And here the view of nature therefore also differs in its timeliness. So the former wishes that the nature found the river is restored to what it was 100 years ago, while the latter talks of nature rooted in a sort of generational time span. So what I'm trying to say is that all these local perspectives now meet in some negotiations about the future river landscape, but from different worldviews and perspectives on the river rooted in different time perspectives. So we need to have this in mind, and we need to coordinate these strategically and create some good dialogues between the different perspectives on the river over time. Yeah. So secondly, I want to highlight the coordination between the present and the future in negotiations. So before I highlighted the coordination between various past and the present negotiation, and now we're talking about the coordination between the present and the future. Because in the workshops that I mentioned before, the last exercise dealt with local actors' future visions. So we here ask them, if we look 20 years ahead, are there any new actors? Do we see new collaborations between actors? Do you see any new ways to utilize the river and the surrounding landscape? And do we see any new ways to combine values and interest in new innovative solutions? So across the 4 workshops, we saw some common themes, which was that local actors wanted more focus on especially recreational activities, tourism, a change in land use adjacent to the river, and here especially a change from farming areas to nature areas, and more nature and biodiversity was wished for overall. So through a thorough analysis of these various answers to the future questions found with local actors, I found some underlying interest or values which local actors wanted focus on in the future river landscape. And you can see these identified values or interests to the right. And I'm not going to say so much more about these, but I will instead focus on the fact that it was really interesting that when we map the interest found in the present in the 2 former exercises, which I just showed you before with yellow and green and red post-it notes, it was a completely different value or interest image as you see before you now. So as soon as we started to put the negotiations into a future perspective, we saw a range of new innovative values and solutions which municipalities involved in the climate adaptation master plan could essentially just pick and choose from. So furthermore, in terms of conflict management, we also saw the local actors engage in a better dialogue, build up more sustainable relationships, and find more common interests than actually possible in the present. So essentially, there is a great difference in negotiating in the present about the present versus negotiating in the present about the future. So if we had just negotiated in the present, we might not have matched the actual future wishes found with local actors. It also created a better dialogue as it was easier to identify the underlying interest and move away from the various positions. So what we saw at all workshops was a great ability to think innovatively with future scenarios, and thus a greater ability to think out of the box and enlarge on the pie. And if we are strategically about this in our negotiations, we can co-create future-ready solutions with local, which are rooted in their values and their perspectives for the solutions that we implement in their local areas. So we need to keep this in mind when applying a method like MGA or whichever method you're using for conflict management. So we need to think about what time we're talking in. Are we only thinking about the present? And if more long term, what future are we talking about? Do we talk about a 20 years time span, or do we talk about when your kids grow up, or when this rainfall event occurs again? Because different future spans and different future times give different future scenarios. And I don't have time to go too much into this future coordination, but I can say that I'm concerned with the development of tools and methods for future coordination. So do contact me later on if you're interested in hearing more about the development of these. So just to conclude and give you some key takeaways. It's essential to pay attention to the various paths and stories included in present negotiations with local actors, as these are often the reasons for the contradictory values and views found in the present. And therefore, sometimes it's also a part of the reasons for the various conflicts we might see in our projects. And secondly, it's essential to include a future perspective to our present negotiations, as this often makes it easier to talk about interests, not positions, with stakeholders, and to think out of the box and actually enlarge on the pie. And thirdly, and this is probably the most important one, it's absolutely essential and crucial to include local stakeholders' values, and visions, because this will often increase community resilience in our projects. It will increase conflict management, and we must remember that plans and master plans such as this one I told you about today are essentially rooted in local needs and local conflicts over land and access to, in this case, the river. And also, as earlier mentioned, local stakeholders can often contribute with a range of ideas and ways to combine values and interests, which is therefore also locally rooted. And we can thereafter use these to create added value for our more technical solutions. Yeah, so thank you so much for your time and your participation. And I think now it's time for a Q&A session.
Thank you, Miriam. A fantastic presentation. Before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform, and also you can download a PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. We'll start with the first question. Can the negotiation method be used outside of Denmark?
Yes, definitely can. As I told you before, Howard University developed a method based on 20,000 negotiations from around the world. But I think it's important to keep in mind to also think about the context that it's applied in. So as I told you before, we mainly focused on 3 essences, and maybe it's different in your context. So it can be applied everywhere, but just keep in mind that it's an ideal as well.
Thank you. The next question is, can you tell us a bit more about which conflicts or contradictory values or interests you saw among local actors or stakeholders?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess what I also told you before, it was mainly rooted in time. So when local stakeholders thought that they were talking about the same matters or the same issues, they were actually talking about completely different things. And then we also had a very big conflict about especially the plant growth in the river, which many saw as a solution, while others saw it as not a solution. And I essentially found out that it was because it was based on various forms of knowledge, while some people saw it as a matter you could read about in reports, others saw it as something that you could just see with your own eyes, or you can feel it in the ground. So it's also important to keep these various forms of knowledge in mind.
Thank you. Next question, what is the future process with the local stakeholders from here on?
Yeah, so at the moment the master plan has been sent on to the politicians. And then in the autumn, it will go into a sort of consultation period with the local stakeholders. And then hopefully afterwards, we're going to proceed with some new local workshops where we are going to try these methods with future coordination out. And then there has also been some various forums that has been established, so these local actors can kind of continue the dialogue without our interference.
Thank you. There is a question about BATNA method. I believe it's a best alternative to negotiated agreement. If you can give us an example on where you use this method in your project.
Of the BATNA method, yeah, definitely. So we did have one environmental and nature organization that has kind of a great power in using local citizens that can kind of subscribe to something, and then they can send it on to the politicians. So we knew that they had quite a strong BATNA because they had access to local citizens and also the politicians. So what we did was actually just to ask local stakeholders to kind of really go into the negotiation with an open mind. And what is important to keep in mind is also that if you have a stakeholder that has so much power that they're essentially not going to be in the negotiation situation, it's just not going to work. So you need to have a good preparation period where you kind of talk with all of the various stakeholders and you make sure that they're actually interested in finding a common solution. So that's kind of how we dealt with the issue.
Thank you. There's a question here if you can clarify if the present and future negotiations are considered different climate change scenarios.
Oh, sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Sure. Their question is about the present and future negotiations. Are they considered different climate change scenarios?
That's a really good question. I think in terms of climate change scenarios, I'm supposing that it might be more technical climate change scenarios that's being said here. I'm not sure. But in terms of the present and the future, when we talk about climate change scenarios, it's mostly in the future. So that's what I told you about before, that we need to keep in mind if we're talking about a 20 years time span in a climate change scenario, it's a more open future. Or if we're talking about a rainfall event, for example, then it also gives different future scenarios and different like social imaginaries in people's head. So I think it really depends, but I think most climate change scenarios are in the future, and the ones in the present are mostly in connection to the future as well.
Thank you. Regarding inquiring into the future, have you ever used the appreciative inquiry approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I haven't, but I'm very much considering doing so. And that's the workshops that I told you about that we're going to do in autumn. That's actually where I'm going to try and maybe experiment with some of the various methods that are in the research literature, and that's definitely a method that I'm considering. So thank you for bringing that up.
Can you elaborate a bit more about the method, the approach? Sorry.
Sorry?
Can you elaborate about the approach, this appreciative inquiry approach?
I think it's difficult for me right now because I didn't really read into it yet. I just know that it's there. So yeah, I can elaborate later on in a later Snack and Learn webinar when I know more about it.
Perfect. Thank you. And the last question that we have here, you mentioned a Dutch company. If you can repeat their name.
What company, sorry?
A Dutch company, I believe that.
Oh yeah, it's called P2.
P2, okay.
P2, perfect. Yeah. So they're kind of doing courses in the connective negotiation method, which is a combination of MGA and process management. I can highly recommend them. Very interesting.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions, so we're at the end of our webinar session. So please feel free to follow up directly with Miriam via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Miriam, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you, everyone. I will wrap up the webinar now. Thank you.